Please let me know if my slides are visible to you all.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So today we will be beginning with this small topic called cell signaling. So in nature we have different types of cells, like we have unicellular cells, we have multicellular cells and all. Right. So each and every cell do communicate in some other manner. Okay. So the process is called a cellular communication. So you can see here, like this is your blood vessel, and this is your tissue. So when you have some sort of a pathogen invading, pathogen matlab, a disease causing creature. When you have certain disease causing creature entering your so-called bloodstream or when it's on the tissue, you see the cells tends to communicate with these molecules. Okay, so these molecules tends to differ from particular pathogen, like viral infection हो गया है. Viral infection के time में ये जो molecules आता है वो अलग होता है. When there's a bacterial infection, जो molecules आता है वो अलग होता है. So for each and every kind of harmful stimuli, you tend to have some sort of a molecule coming out, and that's going to aggravate the process of defenses, and that's going to attack them. Okay. Same way whenever you have a regular physiology being happening, regular physiology होने के लिए भी communication चाहिए. Okay. Simple thing I will just tell you, like in homeostasis we have seen that when you have high glucose levels, the cells do communicate. So from liver, the signals are being sent to the so-called pancreas, and from pancreas you are going to have the secretion of a hormone insulin, and the insulin is again going to travel through the blood and it's going to enter into the liver, and so-called the liver, on the liver you have a process of formation of so-called glycogen. Okay, so excess glucose is converted to glycogen. So this is like one of the simple example where you can actually see that tissues are actually communicating with each other through different humoral factors. Okay, so these all processes are tend to call as cellular communications. So when a cell communicates, first thing, it has to receive a signal. Okay, the signal can be the interior molecule or it can be the exterior molecule. So as soon as the receiver receives the signal, it is now uh, transported ahead for several other purposes. Like why is communication required? What is the signal doing? It can do homeostasis, it can do metabolism, it can be for cell division purpose, it can be for activation of certain proteins that are required for any kind of a cellular functioning. So this way you have different types of targets. The target can be any of these. Okay, so when you are actually getting a cell, when you're actually getting a cell, when a cell receives a signal, the signal will be able to get delivered in a stepwise manner. Okay, it doesn't straight away go and affect the target. What happens is that what happens is that it will be conveyed in a series of steps. Okay, it will be conveyed in a series of steps. Just give me a minute. Yeah, thank you for waiting. So the signal will be conveyed in the form of a stepwise manner, and you call this entire series of steps as signal transduction. Okay, so what can be the signaling molecule? The signaling molecule can be a protein, it can be a small peptide, Can be an amino acid, can be a nucleotide, can be a steroid, can be a fat, can be a gas like oxygen, nitric oxide, carbon monoxide, or can be any other molecular based derivatives. Okay, so these all can initiate a process, and these can be called as signaling molecules. Okay, and the for the signal transition also to happen, you require all of them. Okay, in any stage in the entire process of series, you may require these molecules coming in between and carrying ahead the signal from one particular molecule to the molecule to the target. Okay, so where do we get the signaling molecule from? It can be coming out from the exterior, or it can be coming from the cell itself. Okay, so uh, once the signal is being received, the receptor will be binding to it very tightly, and that initiates the process of signaling. Okay, so if you're going to look at the types of signaling, based on the binding, we have two different types of receivers. One receiver can be on the surface itself. These receptors are called as cell surface receptors. So usually when you have an extracellular signaling coming out, extracellular मतलब सेल के बाहर से आपको जब कोई सिग्नलिंग मॉलिक्यूल आ रहा है, तब आपका सेल के ऊपर ही मतलब on the surface of the membrane only you have a receiver. So this kind of signaling is extracellular signaling. Okay, so this is one mode of signaling, and then you have another kind of signaling where you have a protein which basically will be carrying the signal from the exterior, can enter into the cell because of its nature, hydrophobic nature. So hydrophobic, कोई अगर आपका signaling molecule hydrophobic है, so it can cross this plasma membrane, and because plasma membrane also is majorly hydrophobic in nature, so both of them can pass through easily. So once the diffusion happens, the carrier will be leaving the signaling molecules, and the signaling molecule will go and bind to a receiver either in the cytoplasm or either in the nucleus. And this kind of signaling is called as intracellular signaling. You have two modes of communication. One is the receiver is available on the exterior, and the receiver is available in the interior of the cell. Okay, so this is your extracellular signal processing, and this is your intracellular signal processing. Okay, so types of chemical signaling. Now this is based on how actually a receiver is where the receiver is located and how the signal is being carried ahead. Now this is completely based on what is actually giving you the signal and who's getting the signal again. Okay, so based on that, we have 6 different types of communications. Number one is autocrine, which means that this usually we see in case of many of the unicellular cells. Okay, like autocrine matlab auto matlab self. Okay, so a cell will be releasing certain factor which has to do a change in the cell itself. Okay, so this factor can get matlab into the cytoplasm, and it can go on bind onto a receiver on the on the cytoplasm, initiating the intercellular signaling cascade, or it can go out of the cell and it can go on and bind on a plasma membrane based receptor, and it can initiate the process. So the molecule is coming from the cell itself. At the same time, the so-called it is going to affect the same cell. So this kind of a process is called as autocrine. Okay, as you can see in this figure, these molecules, the signal molecules, are secreted by the same cell, and they are again going to affect the same cell. Okay, so this is auto. Coming to paracrine signaling, paracrine means you have the cells in the surrounding. Your signaling molecules are going to affect them or target them. Okay, so this kind of a signaling is called as paracrine signaling. Like you see this kind of signaling mostly in your tissues. Our tissues they are made up of millions of cells, right? So let's consider your liver, let's consider your heart, let's consider your brain. So though all of them are organs, they have different types of tissues available in them, and the communications should happen throughout the so-called cells of that particular tissue for bringing out a synchronous change or for bringing out a active biological function. So to do that, they have to communicate, and this communication is with their neighboring cells, and this kind of a process is called as paracrine signaling. This is the second type. Coming to third type, endocrine signaling. Endocrine, matlab these are the types of the tissues or the cells that can release certain factors called as hormones. So hormones का specialty क्या है? They choose a drainage. Okay, they choose a drainage or they choose a pathway, connective tissue through which they will be able to travel across long distances, and they will be able to communicate to the target cells. Okay, so this kind of signaling is called as endocrine signaling. So you can see here there is a tissue. The tissue is releasing the hormones. The hormones are released into the blood. In the blood, the hormones travel. It can be to a nearby tissue or it can be to a farther tissue, and these hormones can go and affect the tissue. Okay, so this kind of signaling is called as endocrine signaling. Then comes neural signaling. Neural matlab the communication is happening through nerves. Okay, usually we don't see neural signaling in unicellular creatures, but in case of multicellular creatures which are advanced, like most of the animals and all, you tend to see this signaling. Okay, so neural signaling में क्या होता है? The so-called communication happens through diffusion of certain factors called as neurotransmitters at this junction called as synapse. Okay, so this junction between the two neurons is called as synapse. So यहाँ पे ये दोनों neurons connected नहीं है, physically connected नहीं है. There is a space here. So here the so-called molecules are released outside, pushed outside by a process called exocytosis. So once these neurotransmitters goes into the space and they reach the receptor on the next molecule, the molecule, the so-called next cell, neural cell, it gets activated. Okay, and you have a neural communication being happening here. So this communication is happening through two different ways. One is through release of this factor called as neurotransmitter, and the other one is electrical impulses. Okay, so this kind of a communication is called as neural signaling. Then comes the fourth category, one, two, three, four, fifth category called as neuroendocrine signaling, which means that you have a neuron. The neuron is releasing its factors called as neurotransmitters, but these neurotransmitters are also has the ability to act as hormones. So they enter into the bloodstream, they travel to a long distance, and they will be acting on a specific tissue. Okay, so this kind of signaling is called as neuroendocrine signaling. Okay, so this is a combination of these two, where your neurotransmitter can also act as a hormone. So you can call such kind of hormones as neurohormones. Okay. Then comes pheromones. The last one's called as pheromones. These are certain elements. These are certain molecules that are released into the nature by the creatures. Okay. So usually the pheromones play a different role with respect to the context. Like you see in case of these two insects. Okay. So you have a male insect and a female insect, and when they want to go for a mating process, so they release these peculiar so-called scents called as pheromones. So these pheromones will be able to attract the opposite sex. Okay, and that will be initiating the mating process. So this is one level of signaling that usually you see between the organisms, and you can also see the pheromones in dangers. Okay, for initiating dangers, like you see skunks and all. So they will be having the pheromones in their secretions, and that will be keeping this peculiar smell will be keeping few animals at bay. So they won't be able to be an easy prey for bigger creatures. Okay, same way we also do secrete pheromones, and these pheromones usually will be available in our so-called private parts. Okay, like your armpits, like your pelvic pits, where they tend to see that they are associated with more of melanin secretion, and that's the reason. That's the reason why you tend to find our so-called some of the regions a bit darker. Okay, they don't have much of the role in our body, but they also do take part in so-called similar sort of a communication. Okay, between the so-called whenever you have these so-called adult-based hormones acting on different so-called parts of your body. So at that point of time, you tend to see these pheromones taking an active part in communication process. Okay, so these are usually released into the environment, and they will be giving you a peculiar smell. Okay, so this is about pheromonal signaling. So usually this is for organism-based signaling. Okay, communication between the so-called two organisms. So these are the 6 different types of cell signaling that you find in the nature. This can come as a long format of question, or this can even one of them can also come as short format of question. Okay, so you have to practice this diagram. You have to practice this diagram when somebody asks you about what are the different types of signaling. So when they ask you about different types of signaling, first you have to mention that there are 2 modes. One is extracellular mode, and then there is intercellular mode. And followed by that, you have to tell about these 6 different types. Autocrine, paracrine. Autocrine matlab the signal and the target are same. The signaling molecule and the signaling target both are same. This is autocrine. Neighboring cells, paracrine. Endocrine means release of hormones into the blood and affecting it long distances. Neural through neurotransmitter and electrical communications. Neuroendocrinal, which means the neurotransmitter itself is acting as a hormone. We call them as neurohormones. They release into the blood and they will be acting on a different target. Then comes pheromones. These are the factors that can be released into the environment. They give a peculiar smell and they can attain certain function. It can be mating, it can be indication of danger, or it can be anything. Okay, so this is about the different types of chemical signaling that we come across. So, what are the modes? How actually, few tissues can interact. Okay, let's say we have some tissues available like this with certain gaps. So in such cases, the communication can happen through like extracellular mode of signaling. But what about the tissues which are tightly packed up? Yeah, जहाँ पे आपका cells completely packed up है, कुछ जगह है ही नहीं. There is no extracellular space available. So in such kind of cells, how do they communicate? So in case of animals and in case of plants, you have these junctions called as gap junctions. So these gap junctions will be allowing the molecules to cross between the two cells and they will be able to deliver the so-called signals. Okay, तो इस तरह जब आपका बहुत बड़ा सा टिश्यू है जिसमें बहुत cells है, okay, like thousands of cells are there which are packed up without no spaces at all. So if the communication should be delivered into all the cells, then it happens through these things called as cell junctions. Okay, so in case of animals, we call them as gap junctions. In case of plants, we call them as plasmodesmata. You don't have to remember these names. You just remember the name, this thing, cell junctions. So cell junctions do the job. Okay, and in case of the cells which are freely moving in a particular tissue, for those kind of cells, you can usually come across this kind of an interaction. Okay, so if you want to go ahead with the contact-based interactions, then this is one kind of interaction. So your receiver and your so-called signaling molecule will be available on the exterior. So when the communicating partners comes closer, the signal straight away will be interacting with the so-called receiver and it will be initiating the process, the signal. So this process is signal transition cascade. Okay, so this is your contact-based signaling. Then in non-contact based signaling, you have endocrine signaling because यहाँ पे देख लीजिए दोनों cells contact में नहीं है. These are traveling a bit faster. Neural में भी दोनों contact में नहीं है. This is because of you have a junction called a synapse. You have a junction called a synapse. Okay, and in case of paracrine signaling also, like in case of blood cells and all, you can see that most of the signaling can happen through paracrine mode. Okay, so you have exocytosis, and this exocytosis will be initiating a cascade. So these are the contact and non-contact based signaling methods. Now coming to the receptors, we have two different types of receptors. One are extracellular, and the other one are intercellular. So intercellular matlab they will be either available on the cytoplasm or they will be available in the nucleus of the target cell. Okay, so which molecules can undergo intercellular signaling? When a molecule is very small, when a molecule is or small matlab it can be hydrophilic or hydrophobic, or when a molecule is if it's larger but if it's hydrophobic in nature, then these signaling compounds can readily pass through the membrane and they can go and bind to their receptors. Okay, so examples, we have these steroidal based hormones, like you have thyroid hormones, then you have progesterone, then you have estrogen. All of them, they can simply go and get into the cell without any so-called disturbances because your plasma membrane and the nature of your so-called hormones are basically hydrophobic in nature, so they can get into the plasma membrane and they can get delivered to the receivers easily. Okay, so once the hormone binds to a receptor, then this hormone receptor complex will be further initiating several steps, eventually leading to activation of several transcriptions, and that will be tuning the different genes, and these genes will be bringing out a change in the biological function. Okay, you can see the process. For example, let's say we have a testosterone. So when testosterone is there, the testosterone can get into the plasma membrane, bind in onto the receptor which is available in the cytoplasm. Okay, so this receptor hormone complex also can will be able to initiate the signaling cascade that can enter into the nucleus, or this itself can bond form can go to the nucleus, will activate certain transcription factors that will be binding onto your genes. Now these genes gets activated, you have a transcription followed by translation. Now this translated product has to get modified, and that will be giving you autobiological function. Okay, so that's about the intracellular signaling. Now coming on to the extracellular signaling. So when your receivers are available on the membrane, so how does the signaling happen? So we have different modes of signaling. We have enzyme coupled receptors, then we have ion coupled receptors, and then we have G protein coupled receptors. All of them we are saying coupled receptors because here you have more than one particular component activating the process. Okay, so for example, in enzyme coupled receptor, your receiver basically has an inactive enzyme, and this inactive enzyme, when a signaling molecule is coming closer. Okay, so here this particular component is undergoing an induced fit change, and this induced fit change, okay, as you can see here, this induced fit change will be bringing out an activation of an enzyme here, and this enzyme, now when it gets activated, it will be binding to its substrate, and that will be bringing out a change in the metabolism, and based on that your cellular biological function changes. Okay, so this kind of signaling is enzyme coupled signaling. Okay, you can see here in both of these steps you can see the same thing. Right, here or here you can see you have a domain, which is active catalytic domain. Okay, so the active catalytic domain will be coming up whenever you have a signaling molecule coming and binding to them. So this undergoes a change. मतलब ये दोनों दूर में है जब आपका signaling molecule नहीं है, and जब आपका signaling molecule bind करने के लिए आ रहा है, these two are being shifted. Okay, they undergo a shift, they come closer, and this will be activating an enzyme which is located here. Okay, so through different process, like we have methylation, we have phosphorylation. Usually, most of the enzymes undergo activation or deactivation through phosphorylation process. मतलब phosphate group add करने से वो activate होता है या deactivate होता है. So depending upon that, the so-called signal transition cascade can get activated. So this is one type of signaling. Then comes ion channel based signaling. So this usually we find in case of muscles or in case of your neurons. So where most of the functioning is dependent upon the availability of the ions. So when you have high ion gradient, that will be initiating a change, and that will be giving you a response. Okay, like one of the best example I can give you is that when you have high ion gradient on the plasma membrane, of the mitochondrial membrane. So that actually has brought a change in the F0 F1 receptor, and that is able to deliver you ATP. Okay, so that sort of a signaling is ion channel coupled signaling. So there you have the so-called reduction and oxidation reaction happening because of A and C complexes. Okay, but here you have the receivers which are very very specific for certain ions, like calcium ion के लिए कुछ specific होगा, sodium के लिए sodium specific ions receptors होगा, potassium specific receptors होगा. So we have different types of receivers in the cells. Okay, so when those ions are coming into the vicinity, then only these gates gets opened, and that will be initiating the signaling. Okay, so the signaling is carried out by transfer of ions. So this kind of a signaling is called as ion channel coupled receptors. Then comes the third reception. This is one of the most versatile reception that we see in the nature. It's called as G protein coupled reception. Okay, so हमारा biological systems में, especially the creatures like us, okay, we most of the signaling that happens on the exterior will be through this method called as G protein coupled receptors. Okay, so this is basically having domains. This is basically having a domain which has different components here. So when your signal molecule comes and bind to this domain, okay, you have an inactivated G protein which becomes activated. Okay, so this activated G protein now will be acting on enzyme which is intrinsically located near to the complex. So this enzyme, once it gets activated, that will be now activating another component, protein component called as G proteins, And these G protein, हम इसको G protein क्यों बोल रहे हैं? Because it is associated with a energy-based molecule called as GTP, guanosine triphosphate. Okay, so here we see the conversion of GTP to GDP. Okay, and oh, what do you say? And as I was saying, we have a guanosine diphosphate in an inactive format. So when you are signaling, so this is your GDP bond enzyme. Okay, so when your signaling molecule is coming here, you have a phosphate transfer being happening, and that will be donating one phosphate to this GDP, causing in formation of GTP. So once this GTP is bound, the enzyme gets activated, and this enzyme will be forwarding the signal transaction cascade ahead. And that way, you have the outcome coming in the form of many genes or many proteins or many other metabolites. Okay, and this kind of a signaling is called as G protein based signaling. So yeah, you can see here. So this is your G protein linked receptor complex. Usually we have transmembrane domains followed by enzymes and all. So when your messenger molecule comes up and it binds to this signaling receptor, you have a GDP to GTP conversion. So this makes the enzyme active. So when the enzyme is activated, you can see the formation of intermediate compounds. These intermediate compounds will be bringing out a change, and that will be delivering the cellular responses. So this is how majority of the signaling in the cell happens. Okay, या तो आपका सेल में इंटरसेलुलर सिग्नलिंग होता है, दैट्स वन मेथड ऑफ सिग्नलिंग. अगर एक्सटीरियर बाइंड बॉन्ड रिसेप्टर्स है, उसमें से सबसे ज्यादा सिग्नलिंग ये कंपोनेंट से होता है. दिस इज अबाउट जी प्रोटीन कपल रिसेप्टर. Okay, now coming to the secondary messengers. Okay, so what are the secondary messengers? So when you have a first signaling component coming onto the receptor, this one is called as primary messenger. Okay, this one is called as primary messenger. But in between also, there is a mandatory step where you require a production of a particular factor, and this factor can initiate different signal pathways. Okay, मतलब ये factor आने के बाद सिर्फ एक pathway create नहीं होता है, rather it is going to act as junction, and it's going to take part in processing different other series of steps. Okay, so these kind of messengers are called as secondary messengers. So this is your primary messenger, this is your secondary messenger. This is you can say like when you're actually traveling through a route in a train or in a bus, you come across different junctions, right? So this is the kind of a junction where you can actually see that you can attain multiple functions. Okay, so these kind of factors which are acting as the junctions and which can mediate different other pathways are also termed as secondary messengers. So what can act as a secondary messenger? Usually these are small. This can be hydrophobic or hydrophilic in nature. Okay, but majority of them are water soluble. Okay, majority of them are hard because most of the so-called hydrophobic molecules, they can diffuse across the membrane, and they don't have this obstruction coming up with the plasma membrane, so they don't need these secondary molecules. But in case of hydrophilic molecules, they have a lot of obstructions to cross the so-called plasma membrane or nuclear membrane or any other membranes. So in such cases, what happens is that they tend to diffuse. They tend to come in a short format, and they tend to diffuse. And for this to happen, they should be small and hydrophilic in nature. So these secondary messengers are usually small. They are non-protein based components. They are water soluble in nature. Okay, so they can rapidly diffuse into the so-called cytoplasm, diffuse to the membrane, and then they can reach their targets easily. Okay, so most of the processes most of the secondary messengers will be coming up in different types of processes that we can actually see. Okay, so what can be these secondary messengers? They have 4 different categories. It can be a cyclic nucleotide, like you have seen here, cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP क्या होता है? When you have ATP, ATP में से आप एक फॉस्फेट को हटा दीजिए, वो ADP हो जाएगा. उसमें से और एक फॉस्फेट को हटा दीजिए, वो AMP हो जाएगा, adenosine monophosphate. Now this adenosine monophosphate can undergo the so-called transformation, and it can become a cyclic molecule. And such kind of a molecule is called a cyclic AMP. Okay, so cyclic AMP can be one of the nucleotide based secondary messengers. Then membrane lipid-based derivatives, like you have different fats available in the membranes. These can, from these small hydrophilic molecules, can come and they can act as the so-called secondary messenger. Then you have ions like sodium, calcium. These can act as secondary messengers. We have gases. Gases simply straight away they can diffuse and they can act as secondary messengers. Okay, so they release the information from plasma membrane to the cytoplasm and assisting in जितना भी अंदर की तरह सिग्नल ट्रांजिशन कैस्केड होता है उसमें इनका रोल काफी ज्यादा होता है. Okay, so this is all about secondary messengers. So that's all about cell signaling. In case if anyone has any queries, let me know. In case if anyone has any queries regarding this, let me know. It's the same as the way we communicate basically. Like we can go talk directly. We can use the mic, like when you are actually gathering a larger gathering, you use a so-called mic, or you use media. Like you can come up through a movie, or you can come up through a short film, or you can come up through an interview, online based interview, or when two parties are talking, they can talk straight away. They can talk using the so-called communicate using the so-called mobile phones or telephone. They can communicate using telegram. They can communicate using email. They can communicate using letters. So we ourselves has different types of communications, right? So the same way cells also has different types of communications, and this is what actually we have learned today. So any doubts?
No, sir.
Attendance we have not taken because on SAP it is not been updated, but uh, there are 67 people, so I'll give attendance to everyone, so you don't have to worry. If somebody raised a hand, yeah, please tell me. In case if there are any doubts, you can ask me. If there are no queries, you can all leave. Yeah, in case if there are no queries, you can all leave. Yeah, thank you all.